Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
Greetings, super friends, and welcome to this week's show. You guys, this week we have a special treat. We are joined by a New York Times bestselling author whose books you've almost certainly heard of. They're called Why We Get Fat and Good Calories, Bad Calories. Now, way before the Paleo movement took off in a meaningful way, our guest today was one of the early opinion leaders to promote this idea that, hey, not all calories are the same, and that the idea of just eating less, regardless of what you eat, is fundamentally flawed. Though we've covered diet and nutrition quite a bit on the show in the past, it's such a central aspect of optimal performance that it really bears further investigation and occasional repetition. Throughout the episode, though, we take a really deep dive not just into nutrition, but also how it came to be that everything the average person knows about nutrition is so fundamentally wrong. Now, we learn how this information has persisted, why it's been so detrimental, and ultimately how things are starting to change all over the world. Of course, we talk about paleo nutrition, we talk about some common dietary misconceptions, and we have a pretty interesting criticism of crappy science. All in all, I think you guys are going to take away a lot from the episode. I certainly did. Now, if you enjoy this episode and you want to learn more about health optimization, diet, exercise, and how you can get your endocrine system functioning at its optimal levels, I want to let you guys know about a very special opportunity to take one of my latest online courses, which goes into 10 years of my own personal research on endocrine health, diet, and exercise. It's called, fittingly, Become a Superhuman, and you can check it out for an incredibly low price. I'm not even going to tell you guys what it is. Just go ahead and visit the link, and I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised. That link is jle.vi/T, T as in testosterone. And we do really appreciate you guys supporting the show in that way. So without any further ado, let me present to you Mr. Gary Taubes. Mr. Gary Taubes, welcome to the show, my friend. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
A pleasure, an absolute pleasure. Everyone that I talked to who I said that I was interviewing you was like, oh, wow, enjoy. That's going to be awesome. So I think that's a good sign that I'm in for a treat today.
I hope so.
Awesome. So Gary, for those who aren't familiar with you, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you really came to be one of the earlier thought leaders to say, hey, wait a second, what's going on here?
Okay, I was an investigative science journalist back in the 1980s, specializing in controversial science and bad science. Okay, just like, there's bad plumbing and you get a bad doctor and you could get bad service at a restaurant. There are bad scientists out there who don't have a clue what they're doing. And I was sort of fascinated by this pathology. And in the late 80s, some of my friends in the physics community said, well, if you're interested in bad science, you should look at the stuff in public health because it's terrible. And so in the 90s, I started reporting about public health issues and then fell into nutrition almost by accident around 1998, 99. And once I started writing on nutrition and reporting on nutrition, I was just, it was like a rabbit hole that I had fallen down. And my interest in bad science eventually dissolved into like, let me out of here. So yeah, that was it. My first article, I wrote an investigative piece for the journal Science. I spent about 9 months on a single magazine article on the question of whether salt raised high blood pressure, which seems to be, accepted wisdom. If you're hypertensive or your blood pressure's high, you're supposed to eat a low salt diet. I interviewed 80 researchers and administrators for one magazine article, and it just turned out the science was terrible and couldn't really support something that I believed and everyone else believed. And that led me into the question about, does dietary fat cause heart disease, saturated fat? And that was an equally dismaying story.
Wow.
I spent a year entire year on a single magazine article, investigation, and it kind of went from there. And the end result is, this idea that it's almost a joke, that everything we've been taught is probably wrong, and there's entirely healthier ways to eat.
Wow. Okay. I want to unpack so much about that. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people, when first confronted with this idea, will say, well, no, because the government did this research in the 1970s, and they might even throw out McGovern Commission. They might cite the fact that, the entire world eats this way and that fat makes you fat, all that kind of BS. So explain to us why that's not the case and how it came to be, as you discovered, that the entire world has become so fundamentally misinformed about what they put in their mouths.
Well, it's sort of, it's a long story, but it's funny. We're so used to, in any other area of human experience, it's completely acceptable to believe that the government's got it wrong. When we even use the term government bureaucrat, it's not a compliment, it's not a positive term. It's a very negative term. And in this case, what happened is, beginning in again, there's a lot of different rivers that come to flow together into the story, but this beginning with the scientific community 100 years ago, they just didn't really understand what they were doing, what it took to really critically unpack this, using your phrase, unpack this problem of obesity and diabetes. And so they made some assumptions back in the early 1900s that we get fat merely because we take in more energy than we expend. They were studying energy expenditure and energy intake, so that was sort of a natural conclusion. And it was naive, and it left out the 100 years of medical advances that came afterwards that they weren't aware of, and then they never changed it. So from the 1920s through the 1960s, the medical community, particularly here in the U.S., had this belief that obesity is just caused because fat people are gluttons or they're slothful. It was kind of a biblical theory of obesity. And no matter how much they learned about how hormones and enzymes controlled how we accumulate fat and metabolize fat and how we sort of orchestrate which calories we're going to burn in our bodies and which types of calories we're going to store, they hung on tightly to this belief that we just, that obesity is just caused by eating too much. So if you have an obese child, that's a child that eats too much. A woman in menopause, if she's putting on fat after menopause, that's because she no longer cares enough to be thin. And so she eats too much. And it was a very simplistic, naive concept, but it seemed to make sense and nobody questioned it. When I talk about bad science, by the way, a fundamental aspect of bad science is not questioning your core beliefs. There's a famous line by the Nobel laureate physicist Richard Feynman, where he says, the first principle of science is you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. And it's like the first principle of bad science is, well, if I think something's true and it looks true, then I'm not going to question it. I'm perfectly happy to fool myself because I'm so smart. How could I possibly be wrong? So you've got this thing. In the 1960s, the research community, the medical community becomes aware that heart disease is a major killer of, middle-aged American men, and they become obsessed with what causes heart disease. And this nutritionist named Ancel Keys comes up with this hypothesis that it's saturated fat raising cholesterol. And Keys is a very vigorous advocate for his beliefs. And again, rather than worrying that he might be fooling himself, he sort of wants to move forward to prove that he's right, which is an entirely different way of thinking and not a scientific way of thinking. And as a result, and as the medical community gets involved and starts doing tests, the existence of the tests seems to convince people that the hypothesis must be right. So if you're going to spend, say, $20 million to do a trial testing whether saturated fat causes heart disease, by raising cholesterol, while the trial's going on, you assume that the hypothesis is correct. By the time you're done with the trial, you've now spent $20 million. It's perceived as a failure if you don't confirm the hypothesis. So you spin the data any way you can to demonstrate that the $20 million you just spent wasn't a failure and that you had confirmed some aspect of the hypothesis. And One thing leads to another. The government, the media gets behind this idea. The government gets behind this idea. By the late 1970s, you've got this congressional committee run by George McGovern saying, look, we've got this problem. We've got obesity, heart disease, diabetes. Saturated fat seems to be the problem. Everyone should eat low-fat diets.
Yeah.
And one thing builds. It's kind of a cascade effect is the way that the political economists would describe it. So the belief spreads from one group of people to the next, and it reinforces itself. And as research is done, the research keeps going, you never manage to actually confirm the hypothesis. I mean, at one point, the NIH spent $500 million funding a study on women and breast cancer, in which they gave 20,000 women low-fat diets or advised them to eat low-fat diets and compared them to 29,000 women who were eating their own diets. I mean, massive study, $500 million. And it turns out that there's just no benefit from eating a low-fat diet. So instead of saying, hey, maybe we were wrong, you say, well, we probably screwed up the study, and now you're willing to accept that maybe you spent $500 million in error, and
wow.
This sort of low-fat wisdom just keeps spreading and spreading, and it gets to the point even today, as the latest version of the USDA dietary guidelines is finally moving away from this low-fat dogma. If you actually look closely at the guidelines and the foods they recommend and the sort of diets they recommend, it's still all very low in fat. You lean meat and fish, low-fat milk. They just can't get away from the fact that, the world is full of beautiful hypotheses that get shot down by the evidence, and this just happened to be one of them.
Yeah. Wow. It's incredible because, I was going to ask you a couple questions that you touched on. One being, is it better today? And it sounds like the answer is not quite yet. And I guess the second one is kind of how much of it is corruption and how much of it is incompetence? Because I know at some point corporations fit into this as well. And, the soda industry has now done so much to try and convince people that fat makes you fat, not the 24 grams of sugar in your Coca-Cola. So, I mean, it's hard to figure out where corruption ends and incompetence begins and just people, covering their mistakes. Any thoughts on the state of how it actually is today? I mean, is research starting to come out that the government's paying attention to and is actually making policy changes?
Yes and no. So first of all, I'm going to get back and answer your first part of that question, which is, I think if the scientists had done their job right, particularly in the 1960s, had good scientists, critical thinkers been involved in this research. You have to realize that one of the problems with nutrition and obesity research was back in the 60s and 70s, it was kind of an outlier in science. Nobody really cared about it. It was like the home economics of science. And you tended to get second, third-rate intellects. Like the smartest guy in high school, the valedictorian of your high school class in 1970 didn't go off to study obesity in college or nutrition. They went into physics or molecular biology or to Wall Street, or they became doctors or lawyers. This was something that was pursued by, for lack of a better term, second-rate intellects. And they didn't really understand. They didn't have rigorous scientific training. They hadn't been mentored by great scientists to understand how to think critically or skeptically. So had they done their job, the industry would not have been able to take advantage of the bad science the way they did. So even when the sugar industry and the soda industry is saying, look, it's not the sugar, it's the fat, that's not corruption. They were just taking advantage of what the nutrition research community was telling them, in which they were saying, okay, we're going to believe this is true because you're telling us it's true, and why should we believe this fringe scientist in England or this guy over here when 98% of the working nutritionists and cardiologists believe the problem is fat, not sugar?
Wow.
And then we're going to take that information and we're going to use it to maximize our sales because, if you've got stock in PepsiCo or Coca-Cola, you want them maximizing their profits, right? So it's not actually corruption, it's capitalism.
Yeah.
Had the scientists done their job right, they might have still tried, but they'd have failed, or they'd have been a lot harder to succeed, let's put it that way.
Wow.
Then once you get the awareness of the obesity epidemic, which we become aware of in the late 1990s, and clearly something's going on now, things are indeed changing in part through the researchers and thought leaders, like, I hate to refer to myself as a thought leader, but assuming I am, people like me and others who have been, unraveling the bad science and showing perhaps this alternative way of thinking that leads to this idea that, we should be eating more paleo-like, low-carb, higher-fat diets, avoiding sugar and refined grains and maybe vegetable oils rather than avoiding saturated fats and meat and other foods. So, that movement has been building, and the internet has allowed it to flourish in a way that it couldn't have flourished 40, 50 years ago, just as it allows a lot of fringe thinking to flourish, regrettably. And the government, I think the industries that peddle, the sugar industry and the beverage industries and the food industries that sell sugar-rich products see the writing on the wall regarding sugar. I mean, that's pretty clear that they know where this story, that they've lost that fight.
Right.
And that whether the science is right or wrong, the era of big sugar is coming to an end. They're going to postpone the inevitable as long as possible.
Right.
And they're going to try to maximize their profits however ways they can. But I think they clearly see that the safest bet is to start getting out of sugar.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about Coca-Cola. They have a habit when whole grains were in, they went ahead and bought Kashi. When juicing was in, they bought Odwalla. And, pretty soon they'll start buying bone broth companies and startups like that. I'm invested in an organic coffee, like no sugar coffee company. So we'll just sit and wait till the ball drops and they decide, oh shit, we better start producing products that don't kill people.
Yeah, exactly. And you could see it already. I listened to an NPR episode about a year ago where they was talking about a new Coca-Cola product, which was sort of protein enhanced milk that they were selling in the Minnesota. So I think things are changing. They're changing. The internet, again, allows these alternative ideas to flourish. And one of the advantages of the way we think about diet is it used to be so 50 years ago, you read like Atkins and might try a low-carb, high-fat diet or a ketogenic diet and lose weight. And then you go to your doctor and your doctor would say, well, you're killing yourself.
Yep.
And this has got to stop immediately because we know saturated fat causes heart disease. And this guy Atkins is a quack. And I don't care if you lost 60 pounds. I get emails to this effect regularly from people who, cleaned up their diet 20 years ago, lost weight, and then their doctors basically talked them into going back to eating the way they used to.
Yeah, it's like a religion.
Yeah.
It's like, but I'm happy. But no, you're going to hell. You're going to die. But I'm happy.
Exactly. And nowadays, because it's so easy to basically get your own lipids tested, and physicians are willing to do that. So you could say to them, look, just give me a lipid test. Let me do a relatively advanced cholesterol program. We could see in the short run whether or not I'm killing myself.
Sure.
And then there's a lot more feedback from the community, and you can go online and read about thousands of people or tens of thousands or whatever, and interact with people who eat this way and understand how to do it properly, and you get positive reinforcement that you couldn't get 50 years ago. So I think that, and because people get healthier when they give up grains and sugars and starches and vegetable oils, they sort of a much easier decision to make.
Absolutely.
Than it used to be. So I think that's convincing physicians who wouldn't have been convinced 50 years. It's funny, when I first wrote about this for the New York Times Magazine in 2002, I was interviewing all the leading obesity, nutrition researchers in the country, and quite a few of them told me they had personally done Atkins. And they said it was a great way to lose weight, universally. I never had any of them say, oh, I tried Atkins, it didn't work. They said, if I had to lose weight, I give up carbohydrates, and works perfectly, but I would never advise my patients to do it because I'm risking my health. I think I might be killing myself. So they do it short term. And they wouldn't tell their patients to do it because they thought it would be unethical to suggest their patients do something which might cause harm.
Unreal.
And this is leading researchers. I mean, some of the biggest names in the research community. But now, 15 years later, people are realizing, look, I could see all the different ways I get healthier.
Yeah.
My blood pressure comes down. I have better blood sugar control. I've got my HDL goes up. My triglycerides come down. Not only am I losing weight, I'm clearly getting healthier in a lot of different ways.
Yep.
I have more energy. I sleep better, et cetera, et cetera. It's just much more reinforcing to actually eat this way. Although the medical establishments are still full of people who, it's not so much that they can say they were wrong. It's very difficult for anyone to say you were wrong about something that you built your whole career upon. Mm-hmm. And when everyone else and respect believes exactly like you do, there's very little reinforcement that comes from changing your beliefs. It's like you belong to the church of sort of calories in, calories out, low fat, high carb diets. And if you change your belief, you have to leave the church.
Yeah.
Find a different church.
Find new friends.
Find new friends. You're not going to get respect from the church you left behind. All those people you respected who happen to be the leading authorities in the country are going to think you went crazy. Nobody in the church embraces a heretic. No. So there's all kinds of cognitive social issues that keep people believing. And that's true. One of the reasons I like you, I don't even know you, but you believe like I do. So I can like and respect the way you think.
Well, thank you. Back at you. I think there's definitely a selection bias of the folks I have on the show. Although we have had a couple people who are like, starches are okay, eat less animal protein. But that's still a variation of, cut out the garbage and stop eating so much sugar.
Right. And that's I often wonder I would love, this is where you could really make progress with clinical trials, because it would be interesting to know if somebody does, for instance, the McDougall diet, which is a high starch diet, but still low in grains and sugars, the benefit they get from eating the starch and not eating animal products, or is a benefit they get just from not eating the sugar and the refined grains.
Bingo.
Like his website, Dr. McDougall's website, is fascinating because it's full of, he's got his super losers, and they claim almost invariably that they tried a low-carb, high-fat diet and it didn't work. Mm-hmm. On the face of it, I believe these people. So it's interesting. Their experience has to be understood try to understand it without bias. So did they there is a question, did they really do it? Did they do it correctly? Did it fail because they cheated, or did it fail because it failed? And if it failed, then it's fascinating that this high-starch diet worked. And then if the high-starch diet worked, did it work because of the starch content and the absence of animal products, or did it work because of the low sugar, low refined grain, low junk, low vegetable oils? Pick your poison. And those are questions we can't answer. But if you had a rigorous program of research, you could. It would be interesting.
Yeah, he's another one that drives me up the walls. Like his TED Talk, I almost couldn't get through. And I'm looking at a photo of him right now on Google Images, and he has this plate of sweet potatoes and rice. It's just like starch.
Yeah.
I don't understand how it works. But
well, it's conceivable, and this is an argument that I've heard made poorly by some bloggers, but it's conceivable that if you starve your body sufficiently of fat, mm-hmm. some people, and we don't know how many, maybe a tiny percentage of them will somehow preferentially burn the fat that they've stored. So
interesting, yeah.
In fact, you can hack your body in such a way that if you don't feel hunger and you can tolerate whatever is happening. And, people, when the medical community thinks about Atkins, they don't say it like this, but they think about it as hacking the body in a way that causes weight loss. Same with Paleo, but isn't ultimately healthy. And, it's possible that these people, that for some percentage, and again, we have no idea what that percentage is, and we have no idea what it is for people who succeed on paleo diets or low-carb, high-fat diets either, because you only see the numerator, you don't see the denominator.
Right.
So it's possible that this constitutes a way to hack your body to make it give up fat when other techniques didn't work.
Right.
But then even that doesn't say that we somehow evolved to eat sweet potatoes, and rice, and that
Sure.
should be the bulk of our diet for all of us. It just says that maybe for some unknown percentage of people, this is an effective way to get rid of excess fat. And that's all we know.
All right. So let me ask you this, because it sounds like you and I are both on the same kind of paleo page, as are so many of the guests on the show. But you bring a very unique perspective here, which is you've been able to call out shitty science for most of your career. So give me a critical assessment of the science behind paleo. I mean, when we had Lauren Cordain on the show, he talked about this huge meta study that was so vindicating and kind of vindicated his entire career. But is there good science and crappy science around paleo? Is it mostly good? Is it still up in the air?
Okay, so let's define crappy science for a second. I think, I already did this. So crappy science is when you assume something is true based on ambiguous evidence. So you don't have rigorous evidence. Something hasn't been rigorously tested, hasn't survived this sort of trial by fire of rigorous testing. That's technically endless, but you get to a point where you say, look, I'm going to believe this is true because it's successfully survived every test I've thrown at it, and I've thrown
Theory
everything.
Of evolution.
Yeah. So in that sense, the difference between what I've been arguing in my books and what the paleo movement in general argues is a kind of intellectual point. So I say it's a reasonable assumption that the healthiest diet is a diet we evolved to eat, but we don't actually know really well what that is, and it probably differed in meaningful ways in very different populations for long enough to create different genotypes that will respond differently to whatever their paleo diet was. On the other hand, what we can say with reasonable confidence is that with the new features of the environment, the foods that we clearly never evolved to eat are likely to do us damage. And there's enough evidence to say that they have done us damage. There's enough observational evidence to say, what are the new foods? I mean, highly refined grains, sugars, vegetable oils. Again, I'm kind of on the fence about vegetable oils only because I didn't personally do a lot of research on it. So a paleo diet is going to remove all these new foods by definition. Mm-hmm. And in that way, what I would think of as a healthy diet and what paleo thinkers, Lauren Cordain, I'm assuming, would think about a healthy diet, completely their sets intersect. You end up with very similar foods in both groups. Then there are nuances of the paleo diet thinking that, as I understand it, assumes that there's some ideal diet that we all evolved to eat, and that we could identify what that was, and we should be eating that way. And that may be true, but I think that's an assumption that not only had never been tested, but probably never can be tested. And so always has to remain an assumption. So, that eggs are or are not, should or should not be a part of a diet, that sweet potatoes should or tubers should or should not be part of a healthy diet. But again, you can determine this yourself. So it's kind of interesting. I probably eat closer to a paleo diet now than I ever did because I recently, a couple of years ago, I gave up dairy. Now, I gave up dairy because when I eat dairy, I have side effects, not gastrointestinal, but other effects that I don't like. Mm-hmm. And I went through, I was convinced that this had to be, or I was hoping it was somehow dietary related. So as I went through my life, I just removed I didn't eat bacon for a month. I didn't eat coffee for 2 months. I didn't eat red meat for 2 months. I didn't, and eventually I realized that if I don't eat dairy, it goes away. Mm-hmm. But that's me. So that's my individual. So I'm very close now to eating a paleo diet because clearly there's something about dairy that my body doesn't like. But is that true for everyone? I don't know. I mean, the French seem to do very well for themselves.
Right.
And the Swiss seem to do very well for themselves, eating high-fat, high-dairy diets. Now, they have evolved differently than we did because they've been eating different diets for, 300 years, or at least 100 years in our present United States. But those are the kind of issues that I think the paleo diet community tends to forget. And that's where I think it verges into kind of wishful thinking science. Other areas that I won't go as far. So a lot of the gluten discussion, I think could be true, and I think could be a very valid, it's certainly a valid hypothesis, but I don't think it's well tested.
Right.
Again, it's one of these things that you could do as an individual. You could remove gluten from your diet and see if you feel better. And if you feel better, then what the hell? Keep it out of the diet. I mean,
right.
That's kind of common sense. It doesn't matter if it's a placebo effect or because when you removed gluten, you got rid of all wheat and changed the glycemic index of the foods you were eating or any other factor. If it works, fine. The same with a lot of the gut biome science, which the paleo community tends to embrace. I find it fascinating. But I think it's all very new, and there's a whole lot of smoke being generated, a whole lot of noise being generated, and it's very hard. I think it's could be quite a while before we actually know what the signal is.
So if I had to take away kind of a summary, what you're saying is the science is not fully there yet in paleo, but it's more trustworthy than kind of the science that you've disproven in your books, and it looks promising, is essentially what you believe.
Well, I think you end up eating in a way that, to me, by my take on the evidence, is clearly healthier than you would have been eating if you were following the dietary guidelines.
Right.
And the dietary dogma of the past 50 years. So, and I think the basic ideas behind paleo are very sound.
Right. Eat what's natural.
Eat whole foods, eat natural foods. If a factory's been involved, you could probably avoid it. The more closely they are to what they would have been for the past, 2 million years, probably the healthier they are for us. Again, even there's still a lot of caveats. Words like probably, weasel words, one of my editors would have called them. But again, if you can't test it, you don't know. There's one of my other favorite lines about science was from this Nobel laureate physicist Louis Alvarez here at Berkeley, who said, never trust what you can't prove.
Totally.
So one of the problems with nutrition and the government, the way our governments and medical organizations have handled it, is they knew they couldn't prove any of this stuff, but they thought that they had to get us to change our diets anyway. So they said, we're going to assume we're not fooling ourselves, then we're going to do everything we can to get you to believe what we think is true, and the way to do that is to tell you it's true beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Right.
You can't have your doctor saying, well, I think you'd be healthier not eating saturated fat, but I don't really know, so it's up to you.
Right. Well, and the problem is this was all happening at the time when science was becoming in so many other fields like physics and so on, and medicine. In every other aspect, you mentioned from the 1920s onward, like medicine, they got it right, like penicillin and all kinds of anti-inflammatory drugs. And like they were getting it right pretty consistently to where people didn't, I don't think, have a strong enough reason to be like, this is complete BS when it comes to diet.
Well, I think that's just the difference between how scientists think and everyone else thinks. So scientists are always taught to be skeptical of everything. If you can't prove it, be skeptical of it.
Yeah.
And medicine is full of mistakes, but you're right. It's also full of tremendous success stories. And what you hear and what you see are the success stories. So again, you see the numerators, you don't see the denominators of failures.
Right.
You can't judge. I used to be a poker player when I was younger. And the classic mistake that bad poker players always made was that they based their strategies on their wins, not on without being aware of how much they lost when they did the same thing. So it's like, I'm going to play 10 jack off suit in Hold'em because last time I played 10 jack off suit, I miraculously hit the inside straight and I made, $1,000 on one hand. Therefore, I'm always going to play 10 jack off suit. And you got to be able to know the wins as well as the losses in order to know if a strategy is beneficial or not. And again, in medicine and fields of public health, there's just, the entire fields of public health that very much influences what we think of. The more than anything, our nutritional guidelines are driven by this field of public health called epidemiology, where you follow cohorts of healthy people for 20, 30, 40 years. You see what they eat, and then you see what diseases they get. And you end up with this association between the diseases and diet choices. And then you assume that that's a causal association. So I see this is the articles you see in the paper every day, that say like people who drink a lot of coffee have an increased risk of pancreatic cancer. Therefore, coffee drinking causes pancreatic cancer. You should not drink coffee anymore. This is a field that only exists because it had a few, monumental triumphs 50 years ago, notably cigarettes and lung cancer.
Right.
And ever since then, every screw up, every losing hand this field plays, every time they play another 10 jack offsuit and lose, it's irrelevant because the one time in 1965 they won.
That's a really fascinating way of looking at it, and you're absolutely right. It's this huge cognitive bias. Huh.
By the way, the reason I gave up playing poker was I used to, while I was writing my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, I used to do my best thinking in the shower in the morning. And one day I was playing online, and one day I just found myself in the shower going, instead of thinking about the problems with the book, I was thinking about why some idiot in London online was playing 10 jack offsuit in that hand and pulled the inside straight against me. And it was like, okay, this has got to stop.
Got to go. How funny. So tell me a little bit about ketosis, because I've heard evidence for and against. I'm a pretty strong advocate. I am on a ketosis buzz right now as we speak, but people have told me before that it can be damaging, to the kidneys or the body or whatever else. Where do you fall on the ketosis issue?
Okay. And again, I don't know. I don't think it's damaging. Okay, not in the short run. I think the studies suggesting, there's a lot of issues, beginning with the pushback against the Atkins in the early 1970s, or even earlier with the pushback against Atkins' predecessors. People were scared, medical practitioners were scared of the concept of ketogenic diets because they were aware of the problem of ketoacidotic shock and diabetes is something that kills diabetes, and they couldn't quite wrap their heads around the fact that there's a fundamental difference between ketosis, when your liver is generating ketones, and ketoacidosis, which is when this sort of end state in diabetes.
Right.
So there was always pushback, and when doctors like Atkins were pushing ketogenic diets in these ludicrously best-selling diet books, the medical community pushed back by dragging out everything they could find that might suggest that these were harmful. And again, I don't think that the community was being venal. They were legitimately scared about this concept, and so they weren't interested in studying it. They were just interested in kind of killing it.
Wow.
And a lot of these things are hangovers. So the idea that you could do harm to your kidneys in part is because you're eating a high meat diet, so it's a high protein diet. So your kidneys can't deal with the protein load.
But your kidneys can excrete protein pretty easily unless you have like rhabdomyolysis and it's just flooding. But
so that's the thing. If you have kidney damage, maybe this isn't the best thing to do. But then the question is it going to create kidney damage if you're not? It's kind of like saying if you lift weights, is that going to make you weaker because it puts such a strain on your muscles?
Right.
And again, who knows? But when you actually look at the evidence, it's just not there. Okay. And then when you speak to clinicians, like Michael Eads, for instance, a co-author with his wife, Mary Dan, of Protein Power about issues like this, he'll say, look, I put 10,000 patients on these diets. I never saw kidney problems.
Wow.
But that doesn't worry me. The question is, to me, is more, do you have to be in ketosis to realize the benefits of these diets, whatever the benefits are, whether you're using a ketogenic diet to, treat pediatric epilepsy or to lose weight or to reverse type 2 diabetes or just to be healthy, is there a long-term benefit to being in ketosis rather than, say, restricting the carbs and not being in ketosis?
Fair point.
And are the benefits you see, the buzz you're feeling right now, for instance, from the ketones, or from the fact that you're sort of maximally making fatty acids available to your body for fuel?
Right. Also fair.
Yeah. And so those issues, I just don't know what the answer to. I have friends I respect in the community who are fervent advocates of the need to be in ketosis. I frankly, myself, I've never checked. I've been eating this way for 14, 15 years and have never once checked my urine or my breath for ketones. I was probably in ketosis on and off over the years because my wife used to complain about my breath.
There you go. That's a good sign.
Sweet meat breath, she called it.
Yeah.
She's a humorist, by the way, and she had some jokes in some of her books about sweet meat breath.
Oh, I didn't realize your wife's also an author.
Yes, she is.
Ah, interesting.
It's a long story. But anyway, so that's the thing. I do not think it's harmful. I don't think the evidence is there to believe that. And I think that's just a hangover from like I said, the kind of anti-Atkins hysteria of the 70s and the medical community's cognitive dissonance trying to deal with the concept that these diets could be healthy. But I'll give you a good example, by the way, of where it gets messy. So we've known since the 1920s that ketogenic diets are very effective for epilepsy, and particularly pediatric epilepsy. Mm-hmm. So the question is, and I mean, it's remarkably effective. So kids who are completely intractable to drugs, who have seizures every hour. I mean, these kids, their lives are nightmares, and these are kids who their parents will kind of, dress them. They'll have to wear football helmets and padded suits so that when they have their seizures, they don't get harmed. And put them on a ketogenic diet, and a third of them, it cures the pediatric epilepsy, and a third of them it treats. So a third of them can go on the diet for like a year and then get off and never have a seizure again. This is no drugs work for these children. And then a third of them, the diet will keep the seizures under control, so they'll have to stay on a ketogenic diet. So now the question is the diet working because it's removing the carbohydrates that might be somehow triggering the seizures somehow? Or is it working because the ketones being generated and used for fuel in the brain are inhibiting the seizures, or some combination of those two possibilities?
Right. And question 3, for that kid, does it matter at all?
Does it matter? So about 7-8 years ago, some very smart researchers at Harvard did a study of a low glycemic index diet for pediatric epilepsy. So this would be a carb-restricted diet with no highly processed grains or sugars. And they reported, again, you never know if it's right or not, but they reported that the effects they got were just as good as the ketogenic diet. And this would not have been a ketogenic diet because it still had plenty of carbs in it. Just healthy carbs, for slow carbs, as Tim Ferriss would call them.
Right.
So that would argue to me that you can disassociate the effect on the seizures from the ketones and the ketosis. I would want to see that study replicated rigorously before I believed it.
But I think it's still, seizures are a pretty good indication that something is dramatically wrong, just like insulin sensitivity and stuff like that. And I think it's just one more piece of very interesting evidence, not so much for the ketosis, but really for this rebuilding back insulin sensitivity. We had a previous guest, Ryan Muncie, who talked about this, 50% of people, or did we talk about it? I recorded it today at some point, but I think Ryan and I were the ones who talked about it, where 50% of people in America are on some level insulin insensitive. That's crazy. That's a big red flag.
Yes, no, that is. So that's the argument I've been making, that this sort of paradigmatic disease of Western civilizations is insulin resistance and the diseases that cluster with it, which are, in which it may or may not fundamentally cause. So obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, quite possibly Alzheimer's. And they're all insulin resistant states. And I would argue that, so the question becomes what causes the initial insulin resistance? And there are a lot of different hypotheses. In my book coming out, the sugar book, that hopefully will be out by the time this interview is aired, I suggest that the prime suspect is clearly the sugar content of the diet, modern Western diets. But there are other people who would argue that it's vegetable oil, or the conventional thinking is it's eating too much of everything and sedentary behavior. But the question is, it's clearly insulin resistance. is critical to all these disease states. And another point worth making is that one of the counterarguments is, well, what about people who get these diseases who are not insulin resistant? So you can find obese people. In fact, a lot of very morbidly obese people are insulin sensitive. Mm-hmm. So how can you blame obesity on insulin resistance, which is a legitimate question to ask? But we measure insulin resistance as, sort of a cutoff on a scale and depending on different measures. And it's mostly a measure of how the lean tissue responds to insulin. And what you want to know is it's very complex, homeostatic insulin dynamic in the body. And so I've lately been using terms like insulin disruption or insulin disturbance because there are very ways that you could have, the foods we eat and whatever, if you think it's sugar, as I do, the sugar content of the diet could influence insulin resistance or insulin signaling without necessarily showing up as insulin resistance on, some HOMA-IR test or whatever you might pick up. So for instance, one of the arguments I make in my books based on the evidence for insulin resistance causing obesity is if your lean tissue starts to become resistant to insulin, so your muscles and your organs, your fat tissue remains insulin sensitive. So one of the things insulin's doing is it's telling your fat tissue to hold on to the fat that you've consumed and the fat that you've stored, and it's telling your lean tissue basically to take up glucose and oxidize it for fuel. Mm-hmm. So if your lean tissue, your muscle cells don't want to take up the glucose, your fat tissue is holding on to the fat, and your fat tissue is still taking up glucose because it's responding to insulin long after the lean tissue becomes insulin resistant. So if you had a scenario, all you have to you could think of this as looking at the difference in insulin sensitivity and resistance between the lean tissue and the fat tissue is determining which calories are going to get stored and which calories are going to get oxidized, sort of how you're going to partition fuels. So you could imagine people whose fat tissue is so hypersensitive to insulin that they're going to store calories and hold on to fat and accumulate fat even when you're, from basically the moment they're born. Even while their lean tissue is relatively insulin sensitive, it's only insulin resistant in comparison to the fat tissue. And now you have a person who might show up, and again, I'm speculating wildly, this is a thought experiment, a person who, if you did a study, is going to show up as insulin sensitive, and yet throughout their entire life is going to be storing calories, accumulating calories as fat, in fact, to the point of being morbidly obese. So how would you treat that person? Well, the best thing to do would be to lower insulin as low as you can possibly get it, mm-hmm. which means a ketogenic diet, right?
Yeah.
So even though this person's insulin sensitive, they would still have the maximum benefit on their weight. And we don't know how much of a benefit that would be, but the maximum benefit would still come from reducing insulin as low as it'd go. And again, speculation, but this is part of the problem with, we have to make decisions for the medical community and medical treatment about how to measure insulin sensitivity. I don't know if it's possible to measure the insulin sensitivity of the fat cells without doing a biopsy.
Right.
And you don't want to do a biopsy. I mean, I would argue that if someone's accumulating fat, their fat is still sensitive to insulin.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, Gary, I want to give you an opportunity to talk to the audience about what you're working on now. So there's two things, and I'll let you choose which one to talk about first, because I don't want us to run to the end without having covered it. The first being the Nutrition Science Initiative and what that does. And the second, obviously, let's talk to the audience about the new book and why they should check it out.
Okay. So the Nutrition Science Initiative is an organization that I co-founded 2011 with Dr. Peter Attia, and the idea is to fund and facilitate research that can target it at resolving the controversies that we've been discussing. We had great luck raising money, particularly from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation in Texas, to fund 4 research projects, 3 of which are ongoing. This past January, Peter left to pursue other things, and we're still continuing with the organization, but at the moment we are having less luck finding the funding we need to pursue future studies. We have a list of studies we'd like to see get done. Type 1 diabetes now at the moment really looks like an ideal area to target the benefits of carb restriction versus other types of dietary approaches. We hope still to be able to raise the money to get these studies done, but the last 9 months have not been easy for us. Let me just put it that way, or the last year, depending when you air this. My sugar book, The Case Against Sugar, is my latest book. It's out December 26th, I think, 2016. And The Case Against Sugar is exactly what the title. I finally got to write a book with exactly the title I wanted. So I just want to explain how I think we should think about sugar as a society, what the evidence suggests, this idea that sugar might be the fundamental trigger of insulin resistance. So, and by that I mean, I like to think of it in genetic terms. You have populations all around the world with different genotypes, and they all eat different types of diets, and yet over the past 50 to 150 years, they have manifested this explosion in what's the obese and diabetic phenotype. They've done it at different paces, at different eras, and the question is, what changed in the environment to do this? So what do you add to every diet in the world that results in explosions of obesity and diabetes? And the obvious suspect is sugar. And by sugar, I mean sucrose and high fructose corn syrup and, the caloric sweeteners. So I want people to understand that. I want people to understand the history, the evidence, the ambiguity in the evidence, why it's so hard to prove one way or the other. And so we can all make informed decisions on whether or not we should continue consuming sugar at any level. And then the last chapter, the epilogue, is called How Much is Still Too Much? Because clearly I think, I wouldn't write this book if I didn't think sugar was the problem, the most likely suspect in this crime that's been committed. So, and I'm hoping that, people want to understand. And one of the things I want to clarify is that we're not talking about empty calories that we eat in excess. The issue is sugar uniquely toxic? One of the arguments I make is that if sugar didn't exist, diabetes would be as rare a disease today as lung cancer would be if cigarettes did not exist.
Wow, I really like that.
Yeah, I think it's important. I don't know if people want to read a book that ultimately is, could be wrapped up as don't eat sugar, but I think it had to be written, so I did.
That's fantastic. And so this episode will most likely come out the day after the book is released. So if you guys haven't checked it out, please go ahead and check out The Case for Sugar. We'll put a link to it in the
case against.
Yes.
Case against sugar.
Of course. Very important distinction. Do not read The Case for Sugar. Whoever wrote that can't stand by it.
Well, you can read both.
One might be more convincing, though.
Yes.
Awesome. So, Gary, I want to ask two final questions here. First of which is, where can people learn more and get in touch with you? Where should we send them besides, of course, the book?
Okay. Well, I have a website, obviously, GaryTaubes.com. So, and you can reach me through the website, and you'll then get a message saying I'm too busy to respond immediately, so have patience. And I do read every email that comes in. I try to respond at least once to every email. That's dependent, obviously, on the flux of emails coming in at any one time.
Fair enough. Well, I think that's still admirable that you're answering every email.
Okay. Well, we'll see if I can keep it up and still put my kids through college.
All right. Very cool. So
we'll see if my kids actually want to try enough to go to college. That's another issue.
Well, yeah, that's a whole other, to listen to Peter Thiel, that's another assumption that we should maybe question.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, very good. So, Gary, I want to ask the final closing question, which is, if people take away just one big overarching message from this episode and they carry it with them for the rest of their lives, what would you hope for that to be?
Boy, that's a tough one. I should have read your... Was that in the list of questions?
It was. But it's fine. We can fly off the seat of our pants.
Sugar and highly processed grains are very likely the cause of the chronic diseases that kill us. So if we want to live a long and healthy life, the diets we consume should probably, begin with being highly restricted in sugar and refined grains.
Love it.
However, whether vegan, carnivore, ketogenic, omnivore, get rid of the sugar and refined grains, and you will very likely be almost as healthy as you can be.
Fantastic words to end on. Easy to remember, easy to follow. Gary Taubes, I want to thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking with someone, and not just because we agree on literally everything, but also because I think you have so much wisdom to share and so much passion and energy about this. It definitely radiates.
Okay. Well, Jonathan, thank you again for having me. It was great fun, and I'm delighted that you and others are helping spread this forward.
An absolute pleasure. You take care.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
All right, super friends, that's it for this week's episode. We hope you really, really enjoyed it and learned a ton of applicable stuff that can help you go out there and overcome the impossible. If so, please do us a favor and leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher or however you found this podcast. In addition to that, we are always looking for great guest posts on the blog or awesome guests right here on the podcast. So if you know somebody or you are somebody or you have thought of somebody who would be a great fit for the show or for our blog, please reach out to us either on Twitter or by email. Our email is info@becomingaSuperhuman.com. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.